Good afternoon. Thanks very much all for coming. It's great to be here. My name is John Turo. I am a senior product manager within AWS, and I look after our simple notification service. And by the time we're done today, you're going to know more about how push notifications are a really important part of the customer experience that your game players experience, and a really important part of how to re-engage them to make sure they have a long-term relationship with you. And we'll look at some ways to send those notifications more easily and more effectively. So let's get started. I'll start with some data that our gaming customers tell us backs up what they kind of already believe, which is that it's really hard to keep customers who download your app, even after you've done all this work to build and launch a great game. And even after you've done all this great investment to get players to download and try your game, you have 90 days or less to keep those customers that you have your trial with, your audition. And 2 in 3 of the apps that get downloaded will be abandoned within those 90 days, meaning they'll get deleted or never played again, which is just as bad. And so actually, a critical part of the customer experience is re-engaging your customers once they've installed your app. Okay? And there's actually a powerful channel that you can use to do that, which we call push notifications. Given that your app keeps running in the cloud, your customers have given you permission, a channel, to communicate relevant messages to them that re-engage them with the game, that show that the game is still playing even if they're not. And it's magic when you combine the right message for the right device or the right user at the right time. As we'll show with some data and some examples, it really works. So today we'll talk about what are push notifications, why are they hard, and how to make them easier, how simple notification service can help you send them more effectively across platforms, and how you can combine that really powerful building block with some of the other analytics offerings that Amazon has for gaming developers to send effective engagement messages to your customers to keep them coming back and build long-term relationships. So let's start with some terms. Push notifications, as a reminder, push notifications are the text-like messages that get sent from an app to a mobile device. And a user has a choice to read or ignore those messages, or actually to tap the message and launch right into the app. They're super finely targeted in the sense that each push notification is actually delivered to a particular app on a particular device. And it's a powerful channel because your users have opted in to receive them from you. So unlike some other channels, it's entirely opt-in, and you can take that into account when you're deciding what messages to send. And what's really funny when you speak to the end players of games is they like this. They've downloaded your game because they are intrigued by the idea. They want to experience it. And so game players actually like to hear from their games even when those apps are backgrounded. And so here's one of our developers called Plumbee relaying a message from their customers saying, actually, it's hard to keep up with this game in my busy life. I would love to know when something important is happening. So let's talk about some of the major use cases for push notifications. What are some ways that we've seen developers using them? And I would split them into 3 categories. The first is broadcast, where you're sending identical messages to large groups of players at once. Second type is direct, where you're going to send very narrowly, finely grained messages to individuals. And the third is closed-loop messages, where you can actually influence the content of your message based on downstream actions that your players are taking. So to focus first on broadcast messages, again, this idea that I have lots of users and I'm going to mass communicate to them. For example, if I have a new feature or a promotion that's starting or a segment of users that I want to communicate with over and over again, I can send mass messages to them. And you might see examples like this in the games that you've built or the games that you've played, that there's a new jetpack available, or there's a new episode available, keep your streak going for monthly actives. Okay, and this is sort of a broad brush view of messaging that, again, can get a large group of your customers based on something you know about that large group to re-engage. Broadcast messaging. There's a second type of use case that we call as direct, which more closely maps to the underlying architecture of push, the underlying design of the technology, which is one-to-one. Because push notifications give me the granularity to send a notification to actually a single device, a single application on a single device. And this is really important for gaming, too. You can think about it's your turn to play, or John invited you to a game, or your farm is ready, or your lives are refilled, your account is almost up for renewal, right? So these are the sorts of messages that you can start to think about when you want to engage an individual. And finally, to finish setting our terms, are closed-loop notifications. Closed-loop notifications can actually be a variety of either direct or broadcast. The distinction here is the connection to the cloud. I can take advantage of the fact that my notifications are getting sent from the cloud where my data lives and my aggregate information and analytical horsepower lives to decide what are the right notifications to send and what are the right audiences and what are the right times. And I can experiment. This can be an ongoing iteration where I decide what is the right treatment of notifications to send. How often should I send it? What time of day do my players like to hear from me, depending on different groups? What sorts of segmentations should I use? And to be clear, I'm not trying to set up some sort of progression where there is some least and most advanced type of notification. Actually, we look at this as a box of tools that ultimately you're going to want to think about combining into the right communication strategy of how you're going to engage your individual players. And this is based on what you know, the art of building your game, right? You're going to think about what is the call to action you're going to want to provide to your players that gets them re-engaged. And you should think of push notifications that way. They are a call to action. As heavily as we invest as developers into acquiring new customers, it's at least as powerful to re-engage the existing players that we have. And we can use push notifications to do that. So I mentioned briefly a little while ago an early customer of SNS called Plumby, which is a mobile games developer based in the UK. And Plumby is a really wonderful studio. They have a very popular game, one of which is called Mirrorball Slots. And customers love Mirrorball Slots because you can do all kinds of in-app purchases and upgrades to enhance the experience. But they also love Mirrorball Slots because there are time-based challenges that pop up. The game is not static. Actually, at certain times of the year, the game is special. And so the customers will log in to play at those times, and this turns out to be a great engagement strategy into which push notifications are deeply integrated. The schedule would look something like this. I'm going to send one push notification to my players to say, hey, there's an offer that's starting right now. It's going to last for this period of time, some number of days. And that number of days later, I'm going to send a second push notification that says, hey, it's the last day to claim that offer. And finally, when the redemption period for the offer that customers have opted into comes, that is time for a third notification that says, hey, this is the third event. Everybody can come play and redeem their offer now. And Plumby have been kind enough to share the results of an experiment that they did where they sent some of their customers notifications and others only used other channels that did not involve push notifications to the device. And what we saw is a pretty powerful piece of evidence that push works, that matches up kind of with the anecdotal sense that many of our developers tell us they have. Push is powerful for engaging players with your game to get them to come back, but also keeping them over time. You can see that the chart on the right that includes push versus the chart on the left without push not only starts higher, but stays higher. So push is really powerful when you use it the right way for engaging your customers and keeping them over time. It's about percentage of customers. The question is, how do we define engagement? It's about percentage of customers coming back over time. So let's talk about how push notifications work and why they're hard, and why it's hard to get it right, and how simple notification service, which is an AWS offering, can make that piece of your architecture much simpler. We call them push notifications because they're truly pushed. There is a persistent connection in the cloud to each device that your players own that, when it's time to send a notification, actually drops the notification down to that device. And so it's extraordinarily fast. From the customer's perspective, the delivery is almost instant. And again, it works from that persistent connection in the cloud to your device. So there's no polling or anything like that. And in order to efficiently use the battery and the network that deliver these messages, push notifications rely on third-party platform services that are built into the OSs of the devices that you build for. So there's a platform service for Apple, and a platform service for Google, and a platform service for Kindle Fire that deliver notifications to the devices that your players own. And so as a developer that wants to send push notifications, you hand those notifications to the platform service, who's going to get them where they're going. And you wrap them in an envelope that is addressed to a token. And the token corresponds to an individual app on an individual device. So your total number of tokens will correspond exactly to your installed base of active apps. And so the push services ask you to do some hygiene around that list of tokens. You're going to listen to them for asynchronous feedback about which apps are still active and which apps may have had their tokens rotated or swapped. And so in exchange for delivering these notifications via the push services, you've got to do some hygiene around that database and match the tokens to the users and the devices that are in your database. So it's a little hard, and it gets harder because, as I mentioned, there is a different platform service for each platform that you're going to use. So if you're going to support, for example, 3 platforms, Apple, Google, and Fire, you're going to be dealing with different APIs, different forms of feedback, and different feature sets on each device. And if you're going to try to take advantage of those rich features, it gets more complicated. And because scale looks like more than 3 devices, it could be tens of millions or hundreds of millions of devices. Actually, this gets really complicated for developers who have to maintain all these interactions across multiple platforms. And honestly, the architectures for push were built before very many developers had been able to achieve this kind of scale. So it's kind of a surprise for the whole industry. It's really hard to do this well. So developers tell us they, in the past, have solved this problem in a very common way, which is to spend a couple of weeks building what they call as a push intermediary service. This is an independent cloud service that is written by the developer, whose job it is to abstract away the differences between the platform services, handle things like the token management, queuing of notifications, abstraction of different platform features. And so developers tell us they have been independently reinventing this wheel for almost every app that they build with a one-off push intermediary service. And in some ways, it works great because it abstracts away the problems that we spoke about. It abstracts away the differences between the APIs. It gives you access to some or all of the underlying features. But even as it solves those problems, it introduces new ones. The underlying push services are free, but a push intermediary that I build and run myself is not. I have to operate it and fix problems. I have to scale it. And I'm probably going to need some infrastructure to run it, some compute, some database, some storage. And so this free and basic piece of my architecture has become complicated and costly. And so it's in this context that about 6 months ago, we added a new feature to our simple notification service, which is called support for mobile push. And so we've kind of extended SNS to become a managed, scalable, cross-platform push intermediary service that you can access by the drip, so that you don't need to provision or scale or configure or manage the service, but rather you can just send messages to any of these 3 platforms. And you can start with a couple of messages and scale to millions or hundreds of millions, and a couple of devices and scale to hundreds of millions of devices. It's elastic. You just use it as you need it, and we worry about the pain of making that work simply. And we've built this in a way that you can also get started for free. Every account on SNS can send 1 million mobile push notifications for free every month, after which you pay $1 for every million notifications that you send, sometimes less. So it's pretty easy, as we'll show, to get started with SNS. So that's kind of the overview of what SNS does and why we think it's important. Let's talk a little bit about how it works and actually get started using it. We'll send some notifications. As I mentioned, SNS works just the way an intermediary application that you would build works. It interfaces with those third-party push services to deliver the notifications to your players on your behalf. And so you securely add the credentials for your application to SNS, and SNS interacts with those services for you. That's the construct here. And just as each service has a token that corresponds to the devices, so does SNS wrap those tokens inside an Amazon resource name, an ARN, that matches one-to-one with the token. So you can direct notifications to an ARN that corresponds to a device, or as we'll show, a topic that corresponds to many devices. This ARN system is powerful. It makes our developers' lives a lot easier. Let's talk about that. One important thing that I mentioned is the feedback service. There's this system of asynchronous feedback that the push services use to tell us which devices have become inactive or which devices have become swapped. So you need to register against token B instead of token A. SNS abstracts away that difficulty because we proactively consume the feedback on your behalf. For every token, every device that you register to SNS, we're watching for you so that you can now start to send notifications to an ARN without worrying about what's happening underneath. From our perspective, you don't actually need to access the feedback anymore from those underlying platforms, but you still can if that's important to you. And what's important about this is that it makes your underlying database much simpler, even as it maximizes the reliability of the notifications that you're trying to send. Because the push services can punish you if you're not following the rules of the road. So we make following the rules of the road so easy it's actually transparent. So back to ARNs. The ARN endpoints that you're going to address remain stable, even as the underlying tokens are quite unstable. Tokens can swap or become invalid unpredictably from your perspective. And SNS is going to take care of you, because if you send a notification to an ARN that has token X instead of token A, we're going to direct it properly for you. If you send a notification to the ARN corresponding to token C, which is now invalid, we're not going to try to deliver it for you. But we're not going to return an error either. It's going to help your application run smoothly. So ARNs are stable, a stable envelope for you to use to address your messages that engage your players. What's also powerful about ARNs is that they behave just the same, no matter what platform you're trying to address. So whereas previously you might have had to have different logic that engages users on Google versus Apple versus Kindle, now you can use one set of logic that engages your users according to whatever segmentation or logic makes the best sense for your players. And SNS is going to translate that into the appropriate set of APIs. and the appropriate set of endpoints that it can use to reach the user on the device that she has chosen for herself. So ARNs are stable, and they behave just the same across platforms. And you can use them in a couple of ways that correspond to the use cases we spoke about earlier. You can use ARNs for direct publishing, so you can send a message to John's iPhone 5S. Or alternatively, you can use ARNs as a topic, a pub-sub construct that lets you broadcast messages. So I can create a topic where individual devices are subscribed, and I can broadcast identical copies of the same message to all subscribers of that topic. Two targeting types that I can do. One direct, one broadcast-based with topics. And topics are powerful because I can mix and match. An individual subscriber can be matched to, an individual device can be subscribed to multiple topics that match segmentations that are valuable to your customers. You can think about a segmentation by geography or by individual product or interest or segment of your players. And an individual device can be subscribed across all these topics so that whatever segmentation makes sense for the particular campaign you're running is easy to set up with SNS. So that's a bit about targeting. As far as the actual payload of notification that you want to send, SNS offers sort of an automatic and a manual mode, if you will. In the automatic mode, you can publish once, deliver anywhere. I can say, hello world, here's the message that I want to send, and SNS is going to interpret that into the appropriate API for each platform of each device that your users are using. Alternatively, some of our developers tell us, well, thanks, but actually I'd like to manipulate the API myself because I want to take advantage of badge counts and custom sounds and other added functionality that is specific to, for example, Android. And so SNS gives you this flexibility to, rather than letting us write the API for you, actually passing through the exact API call that you'd like to send. And this is great because where it's a very simple message that you want to send, you can just type that in. And where you'd really like to have the flexibility of manipulating the API yourself, that's fine. You can do either one with SNS. So let's get started. Our customers tell us that whereas in the past they've spent a couple of weeks building their own push intermediary service, and perhaps a day per week managing and scaling it and troubleshooting problems, they've been able to send their first push notifications in a couple of minutes and migrate whole large applications within a couple of days. And here's how it works. If you use push notifications, you've probably already done the first step, because SNS uses the underlying push system, the underlying push architecture that is baked into the mobile OS. So you're going to call the same APIs with an iOS or Android or Fire that you would use to, for example, generate a token. And likewise, you're going to grab the same application credentials that have previously authorized you to send push notifications to your users. In order to add SNS to the mix, we've concentrated on providing a flexible, pretty straightforward workflow, either by console or by API, that allows you to upload those credentials and those tokens to us so that we can use them on your behalf. So you're going to take the cert that corresponds to the app, the parent, if you will, and you're going to take the tokens, the children, if you will, that fall underneath that cert and add those to SNS as well so that it can start managing them for you. So for example, if you have a bunch of existing devices in your app and a push service that you've managed yourself in the past, you can actually provide to us a CSV of all those tokens, and we'll grab them. And then, as new devices come online, you can direct the new tokens of those new devices up to SNS directly or via a proxy, whatever makes sense for your architecture. And so there's a console that you can use that makes this easy, but in case it helps, here's some Java code, for example, that shows how this works in code. And the key API here is the one you'll see in the middle called Create Platform Endpoint, which is a nice little API that is designed to be idempotent. So I can actually register the same token as many times as I want and get the same ARN back. And so it's this machine that translates tokens that are unstable into ARNs that are stable and managed. I can send push notifications once I've done all that, either via our console or via an API. Here's some Python code as another example that shows how straightforward that is to do. And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, then your customers receive your notifications, and I can start to close the loop. So that's a slide overview of how this works. I'm going to take this a step further and tempt the demo gods, if that's OK, and show how this works in real time. So just a moment, folks. So this is the SNS dashboard, the console that you can use to get started with SNS visually. And you can see there are a couple of options here. I can add a new app, or I can add a new topic. So let's start by creating a new app. I'll sit for this part. Now, there are a couple of platforms that we support, one for Apple, one for Google, and one for Fire. And we have a distinct workflow that corresponds to the specific options that are required for each of those platform types. So for example, if I'm going to add a new Apple application, Apple will provide what they call as a P12 file, which you can download from their developer console. And they provide these examples that are not awesome, actually, of scripts that you use to extract a certificate and private key from those P12 files. So one of the nice things that we're particularly proud of is a piece of console logic that takes that P12 file, takes your password, and seamlessly translates that into the cert and private key that you need. And that's it. Once you've added this, now SNS understands your app. I can get started pushing to it. I've already done this, so I'll click Cancel. But add new app would be all that's remaining. From there, I can actually add individual endpoints to my device, to my app, rather, that correspond to installations of the app. And as you can see, there's a token here that corresponds to an individual installation of the app here on my Mac Mini, my iPad Mini, rather. And it's been translated into an endpoint ARN. So this ARN corresponds one-to-one with this token. And yet, if the token becomes invalid or swapped, the ARN remains the same. And so once I've added this token to this app, I can click Publish, and I can say, hello, GDC. And click Publish, and that's it. And if I switch over to my VGA view, you can see right up top, it said, hello, GDC. There it is at the top, hello, GDC. And that's just how simple it is to send notifications with SNS. But I also promised you that SNS was a great cross-platform solution. So let's show how that works as well. Now, I've added a GCM app as well that corresponds to this Samsung tab that I've got. And so I have one token that's added to that Google app as well. And here I can create a topic that says GDC lunchtime. And topics can be cross-platform. So when I dive into this app, I can actually subscribe this Apple endpoint to the GDC lunchtime topic. And I can subscribe this Google endpoint to the GDC lunchtime topic. And then I can just send a notification to that topic and say, it's lunchtime at GDC. And now I've sent the same notification across 2 entirely different platform services to each of these devices. Do that one more time so we can actually see it in action. Let's see. So I'm going to say it's lunchtime at GDC. There it is. And so you can see that I've sent, just a sec. Let's try that one more time. Lunchtime, all hail the demo gods. There it is. You saw it on iOS a minute ago. It's pushing to Google as well here. And so what you can see is that SNS provides this really nice cross-platform integration that makes it easy to send notifications to iOS and to Android and to Kindle Fire. And it's powerful because it's a very simple way to engage your customers and to send those messages that are going to get them coming back and building longer-term relationships with you over time. So I promised a little bit earlier that we were going to show you how to use push notifications not just easily, but also effectively. And so for that piece, I'd like to invite Mike Pesci from our Amazon Analytics team to talk about how to add some intelligence to this channel.
Thank you, John. OK. So get the presentation going again. So Nate spent a lot of time talking about analytics as it pertains to games. And analytics are obviously useful everywhere. And one of those places we can spend some more time talking about analytics is as it pertains to push, the topic that obviously John just spent a lot of time talking about. We actually have a couple more presentations today that talk a little bit about what we're doing in analytics, including a deep dive in A/B testing, which I'll talk about a little bit. So this won't be the last time you see some of these things. So as we go through the day, we can kind of reinforce some of these ideas and topics. First, I'd like to just spend some time introducing some of the products we offer. So the first is called Amazon Analytics. So it's pretty self-descriptive. And it's a simple, free, cross-platform mobile analytics product. And so what we've done is we've built a client for iOS, Android, and Fire OS that collects events that are happening within your app, batches, encrypts, compresses, and sends those things across intelligently. So we take a lot of the complexity of collecting events in the client and abstract it away for you. We send it across to a service that receives those events and then does some things you guys are probably pretty familiar with, including rolling those events up into metrics that you're familiar with, like DAL and MAL and retention. And also, because we support custom events, rolling them up into indicators that are specific to your game, for instance. And one of the important things to note about this that ties to Nate's discussion is we can actually take the events that are streaming out of your app using Amazon Analytics and point them at an S3 bucket or a Redshift instance or a Kinesis stream or any of those things. So, so you can actually do whatever you like with the events that are coming. You don't just have to use the sort of rolled up metrics that we're generating on your behalf. So that's a really, really powerful aspect of this. So whereas Nate before was talking about kind of writing to a file in the client, every once in a while putting it to S3 and then using S3 to import, this service kind of does all that for you. So it's kind of a quick shortcut, takes some of that complexity away. And second, we have Amazon A/B testing, which is also free and also cross-platform. And it's a great way to run in-game experiments. And we'll get a little bit more into what A/B testing looks like in a moment. So I thought I would just kind of show you guys what these products look like. So this is the dashboard you would arrive on if you were an analytics user. So if you integrated our SDK, so basically pull it into your app, initialize it, this is what you get out of the box. You get 9 sort of quick dashboard elements, like heartbeat of your app. Again, you guys are probably pretty familiar with these metrics. And you also get kind of some summary data on what's happened over time. So just to dig in a little bit, because I didn't know how big the screen would be, the top sort of row here shows a bunch of tabs you can drill into for things like active devices, sessions, ARPD, retention. By the way, instead of using users like daily active users or monthly active users or average revenue per user, we use the letter D for device. We don't know if it's multiple users on the same device. We just thought we'd call it was a bit more accurate. So in this case, we call things like active devices, ARPD, and those types. And then we show a number of lifetime devices, average lifetime value for device, which is based on some revenue detection logic. And we allow you to split it by platform, iOS, Android, and Fire OS. I just pulled out a couple of the little almost sparkline type elements of our dashboard that just gives you a sense of what's going on. So this was monthly active devices and one-day retention, two relatively important metrics to a mobile developer. And the point here is it just shows you they're green when that metric is positive over the period. So in this case, the period is November 1st to November 30th, and red when they're not positive over that period. We show an average and change and all those things. A quick heartbeat. And by the way, this all happens right out of the box. Dump the SDK in. You get it pretty quickly. You can dive into any of those boxes to see trends over time. So this is a daily retention for new devices, and we show day 1, day 3, and day 7 retention. Again, standardized, pretty familiar metrics, hopefully, for you guys. So Nate earlier was showing how you can write some queries to look at these types of things. This stuff just happens right out of the box. And then I wanted to also point out custom events. So to the extent that you guys would like to record information about specific things that are happening within your app or your game, in this case in your game, you can actually instrument any type of event you want and package a whole bunch of information with that event. So in this case, there's an event called Shop Visit. Somebody programs that name for that particular event, and then they can create some attributes and metrics associated with it. So in this case, I can see how many times the Shop Visit event occurred, and then I can also split it by game version. This is the A/B testing experiment dashboard, and we'll dive into this a little bit later. So there's a lot of information here, but what this is meant to show you is, first, you can sort of set up a test and segment users in your game who are exposed to that test. We show you how many have seen it, when it was started, basic information. And then we show you what variations are being shown. So in this case, the test includes 5 variations, and those variations are being distributed across all user sessions in the following distribution. So variation A is showing to 20% of your audience. One important thing to note here is if you're in variation A, if your user is in variation A, they'll always be in variation A. Users don't go across variations so as to keep sort of the test statistically proper. In this case, we see variation E. Actually, this is, by the way, a live test. So this is all real data. We see variation E as a massive improvement. And in fact, these variations include beneath them a whole set of variables with this particular developer was testing. The A/B testing demonstration later will go into some more details on this stuff, so I'll be in a little high level right now. This is just some more information on each variation, how many views each variation saw, and the views are obviously correlated to how big of an audience you're actually showing that view. So that was, if we go back one slide, across the distribution next to each variation there, it's sort of grade. And then what the conversion rate is, the change. And then the rightmost column is important. It's the math, and that's how statistically significant the result is. And so in this case, variation E is great. We should push it to everybody. So now we know a little about A/B testing and analytics. It kind of ties things back to push notifications and how we can do really cool things with them. We should ask some interesting questions like, how many of my push notifications result in app opens? Or are users who I send push notifications doing something, really anything you're interested in, more often than those that I don't? Or are there differences between users that opt in or out of push notifications? So these are the types of questions you might start to get interested in as you send push notifications more frequently. And so I thought I'd walk through a couple of examples and show how analytics can help. So example 1 is how many of my push notifications result in app opens is actually a really, really simple thing to do. There's just 2 steps. The first is to create a custom event that is recorded anytime your game is opened via a push notification. And then you simply check our dashboard for rolled up data. Or in other words, check our dashboard to see how many times that's occurred. To show you exactly how easy it is, this is sample Objective-C code for iOS. You simply import our SDK, you initialize it with some credentials, and then you write a custom event. In this case, I've called the event app launch from push. And I submit that event, and then our publish SLA is within 60 minutes. What you would see is, this is the custom events dashboard in analytics. You could, from the top left, you could pull down from the event drop down this particular event, in this case app launch from push, and see how often it's occurring. So tie this to the data on how many events you sent in a particular day, and all of a sudden you have a sense of how many people are actually tapping the thing. So that's really, really simple and interesting, and you can do it very, very, very quickly. So although John tempted the demo gods, and with mixed results, why not try it as well? So I thought what would be interesting would be to show you what this looks like live. And so to do that, I'm going to pull up a live instance of our dashboard. So let me just make sure I haven't been, and I had. So this is the analytics dashboard, just like I showed before. This is a little sample app we threw together in the last couple days, so there's not much data here, so not much interesting. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply make sure that the data I'm pulling in includes the unfinished day. And then I'm going to update my report for that, and I'm going to click on the Custom Events tab to drop into Custom Events. And we've created an event called Push Notification Received. And what we see is, we only instrument it in iOS, but we see is today, if you guys can see that, we've received 3 of these events. So what I'm going to try to do is send a push notification and hope that that number increments to 4, which in the background is a lot of magic. So what we'll do is we'll bump back over to John's SNS push console, and we'll click on the iOS ARN. And then, that's interesting. We'll click publish, and we'll type something like analytics push test. And you guys will have to trust me. I'm going to press publish message here, but I'll flip over to VGA. So and iOS still is not working. Try one more time. I'm calling this one test 2. Huh? Yeah. It's very interesting. Let's make sure we might be having some network issues, which are not uncommon to this building. So what you would then see, hopefully, is a tick, although the push notification didn't arrive, which would usually arrive in 60 minutes or less. In our case, generally these things happened near instantaneously, but you would see an increment there. So that's just a quick overview of what it would look like. You have to use your imagination a little bit. That's example number 1. Thanks, guys. OK. The second example is, and this is a really interesting question, are there differences between users that receive push notifications and those that don't? So this is a bit more involved, but this question is potentially way more powerful. So you may be asking yourself the question, should I send push notifications? Is it annoying people? Of the people who are in my app, does it cause them to go away or do something less? So we think this is a great use case for our A/B testing product, or just A/B testing in general, and we'll just walk through how you might set this up. So the first is you just simply create, and I'll walk through all these steps in the subsequent slides. So you create an A/B test and target a segment. In this case, the segment we're going to target is those that have opted into push notifications. For the sort of the statistical nature of the test, we want to only target those that are receptive to push in the first place. I'd rather not run this test against those who have opted out, because it may actually bias the study. And then I'm going to create custom events that support the test, and then I'm going to deploy the game. I'm going to kick the test off. I'm going to filter push notifications to those in the test group. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then I'm just going to check my A/B testing dashboard that I showed you earlier for results to see if I have a statistically significant result and if that result is positive. So I'm just going to walk you through what this test may look like. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to create a name. In this case, I'm calling my test IEP conversion. So I want to know if sending push notification results in people purchasing items more or less frequently. That's a good indication. If I'm sending push notifications and people are doing it less frequently, that's a huge problem. presumably, if I'm sending push notifications and retaining customers more, they're purchasing more because they're in the app more, as we discussed earlier. I'm also going to create a segment called push notification opt-ins. So in this case, I'm only showing this test to those who have pushed into, who have opted into push notifications for what I just mentioned. It's okay. It's the, yeah. Then I'm going to, there's like a trigger event that says, my users saw this test, so I know to include them in the study. In this case, anytime the app's launched, I'm going to trigger this event so I know all my users have seen the test. Obviously, they have to also be in the segment. So this is a custom event you fire anytime the app's launched. And then I'm going to set a custom event called IAP event, it's the arrow on the right, that fires anytime somebody purchases something. And then finally, this is the magic of A/B testing. I'm going to have a variable in my game called send push notifications. And for 10% of my group, in this case, I'm going to set that value to true. For the other 90%, I'm going to set it to false. And so what this test would currently do, if it was set up like this, is every time your app is launched, 1 out of 10 people who have never launched the app before would get the variable send push notifications set as true. You would then record that notification as somebody who you should send a push notification to, and then you sort of just start sending push notifications, and A/B testing does the rest of the magic. I just wanted to show that you can change distributions in real time. Again, people who are already in the distribution will never change, but for new people, you could change it to 50-50, for example. So now in this case, 50% of the people are getting that variation as true. OK. So just in summary, what would you have to do to actually make this work? You'd have to create the A/B test like I just mentioned, and then you create 2 custom events, which are as simple as I described before. A couple lines of code, one called app launched, and that just goes every time your app is launched, and one called IAP event, which you can put anywhere that an IAP event happens within your game. And then you simply send notifications to the variation group. You flag the endpoint for each user that receives send push notifications equals true, and you send push notifications. A/B testing then records all the information about what those players are doing and automatically does all the interesting statistical math to figure out whether or not push notifications, in this case, are increasing or decreasing IAP events. So in this case, with 100,000 views, and because we set the distribution to 50-50, each variation got 50,000 views. And we see conversions are up slightly, so from 0.8% to 0.92%, which is a 13% increase. But as it turns out, that's a statistically significant increase. So what we could deduce from this test is that by sending push notifications, people actually did purchase more in your game. So it's a really powerful indication that push notifications are accomplishing what you're trying to get them to accomplish, which is people are playing more often, and by way of playing more often, they're purchasing more often. So this is just a way that you can do what John was mentioning earlier, which is take this great and now much easier push notification framework, tie it to analytics, and start to learn some really meaningful, rich information about how they're working for you and for your game. These are just 2 examples I thought about maybe talking to you guys about today. You could do many other tests and instrument many other custom metrics that would help you understand, for example, what happens after a person opens an application from a push notification. What types of events do they do and such? Again, to tie back to what Nate was mentioning earlier, you can take any of the data that's being streamed from the analytics product and point at Redshift, Dynamo, S3. So to the extent that the framework I just described doesn't answer the question that you have, you can use these tools, per Nate's earlier discussion, to answer those more in-depth questions that again, you might have. So analytics plus push is a really powerful way of re-engaging your audience, learning about what that re-engagement actually does, and then obviously continually iterating to create the best sort of re-engagement mechanisms you guys can think of and create. So that is the end of our talk. A quick review, SNS push, cross-platform push to Apple, Google, Amazon, 1 million free per month and $1 or less per million thereafter. It seamlessly scales, durable and reliable as our AWS services, and through our ARN, there's a lot of easy token management. Contact us through these places. Again, this will go online after GDC, so you guys can click on this stuff live. If you want, you can send us a note. John and I will get notes to AWS SNS Mobile Push at Amazon.com. And then finally, we were sworn to tell you. If you click this link, you can fill out a survey and potentially win a Kindle Fire HDX, which, if you haven't picked up yet, is a really incredible piece of hardware. And that's me speaking as a consumer, not an Amazonian. And so we encourage you to fill this out so both we can get better and hopefully you can win. So that is all. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.